My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and for the past 15 years, I've worked as a clinical psychologist specializing in autism spectrum disorder right here in Portland, Oregon. This city, known for its progressive, inclusive vibe, and its unofficial motto, "Keep Portland Weird," hides unique challenges for families trying to get a diagnosis and support for their kids on the spectrum. Portland might celebrate differences with its craft coffee shops, food trucks, and quirky culture. But when it comes to autism, I've learned that even here in the heart of the Pacific Northwest, the barriers are higher than most people realize. The waitlist for a neuropsych evaluation can stretch up to 18 months. Oregon's Medicaid program only partially covers behavioral therapy, and for low-income families, especially within the rapidly growing Hispanic community in Southeast Portland, access is even more limited. Today, I want to share with you not just the statistics I know by heart, like the fact that 1 in 44 children in the United States is diagnosed with autism, but the human stories behind those numbers. The tears of a Somali mother who couldn't explain to her traditional family why her 5-year-old son still wasn't speaking. The frustration of a military veteran who saw echoes of his own untreated PTSD in his child's meltdowns. The moments of breakthrough when a child finally found their voice through assistive communication. Over the next hour, I'll take you through Portland's tree-lined streets, into the halls of Oregon Health and Science University Hospital, the crowded waiting rooms at Kaiser Permanente, and inside the homes where autism isn't just a diagnosis, it's a daily reality that reshapes entire families. This isn't just my story as a professional. It's the story of a community learning what it really means to embrace neurodiversity, with all the setbacks and small victories that come along the way. If this journey resonates with you, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to know they're not walking this path alone. And don't forget your comments and experiences. Enrich this conversation and help us build a support network that goes far beyond this audio. I still remember my first day at the Child Development Clinic at OHSU. It was October 2008. The maples that Portland is famous for were just turning gold. And I had just graduated with my doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Oregon, loaded with theory but very little real-world experience. "Dr. Mitchell," said Dr. Patricia Hernandez, my supervisor, a Latina in her early 50s who would become my mentor, "you're going to find that working with autism in Portland is different than anywhere else. We have families driving for hours from rural Oregon just to get here. We have immigrants who've never even heard the word autism in their native language. And we have upper-middle-class families who think they can cure autism with diets and alternative therapies." My very first case was the Johnsons. Mark, a software engineer at Nike, and Jennifer, an art teacher at a local charter school. Their 6-year-old son, Tommy, had been referred after repeated meltdowns whenever the classroom routine changed. "We just don't get it," Jennifer told me, tears rolling down her face as Tommy lined up the toys in the waiting room by color and size. "He's so smart, he knows all the state capitals, but he can't tell me if he's hungry or needs the bathroom." Mark stayed quiet, his fists clenched. Later, I learned he suspected he might also be on the spectrum, something that's not uncommon. But at the time, we rarely discussed openly with parents. The evaluation process in Oregon follows strict state protocols. First comes the screening, using tools like the MCAT. Then, if needed, a full multidisciplinary evaluation involving a psychologist, speech pathologist, occupational therapist, and developmental pediatrician. The whole process can take months, and every clinician has to document findings according to DSM-5 criteria. Why does it take so long? Mark asked in our second session. If this were a broken bone, we'd be in the ER tomorrow. It was a question I would hear hundreds of times over the years. How do you explain that the human brain is more complex than a fracture? That autism shows up in such varied ways, there's no simple blood test to confirm it. That our own understanding of the condition is still evolving. What I can tell you, I said, repeating words I'd learned to say with conviction, is that every hour we invest now in understanding how Tommy's mind works will translate into years of better quality of life for him and for you. Even back then, I was still figuring out exactly what those words meant. At that time, Portland had only 3 specialized autism clinics serving a metro population of over 2 million people. The gap was staggering, and I was just beginning to grasp what that meant for families. If there's one thing that defines the autism journey for families in Oregon, it's learning to navigate the maze of our healthcare system. The state's mix of public and private insurance plans can be confusing even for seasoned professionals. I think of the Rodriguez family. Maria, an immigrant from El Salvador who cleaned offices downtown on the night shift, brought in her 4-year-old son, Diego. After his preschool teacher noticed he didn't respond to his name and struggled with social interaction, Stokera, she said during our first meeting. Medicaid told me, it's covered. But then they gave me a list of doctors I've never heard of. Some are in Beaverton, some in Lake Oswego. How am I supposed to get there without a car? This was a systemic issue I saw over and over again. Oregon's Medicaid program, known as the Oregon Health Plan, technically covered autism services, but the provider network was thin, especially for families relying on public transit. TriMet, Portland's bus and light rail system, works well compared to many American cities. But for these families, it often meant 2-hour rides with multiple transfers. Maria worked 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. Her husband, Carlos, worked construction from 7 to 4. Finding a schedule that lined up with specialists, limited availability, and their own grueling jobs was like solving a puzzle with missing pieces. Dr. Mitchell, Carlos said in our third session, frustration thick in his voice, back home. When a child has a problem, the whole community steps in. Here, every form we fill out just leads to another form. Every doctor sends us to another doctor. Diego needs help now, not 6 months from now. He wasn't wrong. The American referral system often means months of bouncing from one specialist to the next: pediatrician, pediatric neurologist, psychologist, speech therapist, occupational therapist. Each does their part of the evaluation, but coordination is often poor. In Oregon, we did have the relative advantage of early intervention services free for kids under 3 with developmental delays. But at age 3, children transition into the public school system, and families quickly discover that services drop off a cliff. It's like falling off a ledge, explained Susan Martinez, the transition coordinator for Multnomah County. At 2 years, 11 months, a child might get 20 hours of ABA therapy a week. At 3 years, 1 month, that same child may only qualify for 2 hours of special ed services through the school district. For middle-class families, like the Thompsons, he, an Intel engineer, she a nurse at Providence Medical Center, that meant paying out of pocket for private sessions, costing $60 to $120 each. For families like the Rodriguezes, it meant settling for whatever was available, and hoping it would be enough. Out of necessity, I built an unofficial spreadsheet for my family's listing every autism resource in Portland, from free support groups at the Autism Society of Oregon to private clinics like Dr. Johnson's practice in Tigard. It included transportation details, costs, eligibility rules, and schedules. "You shouldn't have to do this," Dr. Hernandez said when she caught me updating the spreadsheet for the 10th time that week. "There should be a system navigator for every family." She was right. But the truth was, I had become that navigator because families needed it. What I gave them wasn't just therapy. It was an education in how to survive the American healthcare system, knowledge no parent should have to master, but every parent needed if they wanted to fight for their child. Portland has one of the fastest growing immigrant populations in the Pacific Northwest. Somali communities in Northeast Portland, Latino families in Southeast, Russian and Ukrainian immigrants along Southeast Division, each group bringing its own understanding of childhood development, family, and disability. It was while working with the Al Hassan family that I began to truly understand how the concept of autism doesn't translate neatly across cultures. Fatima had arrived from Mogadishu 3 years earlier with her 4 children. Ahmed, age 7, had been referred by his school after teachers noticed repetitive behaviors and difficulties with social communication. In our culture, Fatima explained through an interpreter, "We say that some children are blessed by Allah with a different vision of the world. Ahmed sees patterns others don't. He has memorized the entire Quran. Why would you call this a problem?" That was one of the most important conversations of my career. Fatima wasn't denying her son's struggles. She knew Ahmed had trouble making friends and reacted intensely to changes in routine. But her cultural framework for understanding these differences was fundamentally different from the Western medical model. The interpreter, Amina, a Somali woman who had worked with families for years, helped me navigate these delicate waters. "Doctor," she said, "in the Somali community, when we say Ahmed has autism, people think we mean he's mentally deficient. But when we say he has a special mind that needs specific support to grow, that makes sense to them." I learned quickly that working with immigrant families requires not only cultural competence, but also a willingness to question my own assumptions about what constitutes progress or success in treatment. The Chen family brought an entirely different set of cultural challenges. Li and Wei had moved from Shanghai to Portland when Wei accepted a research position at OHSU. Their 5-year-old son Kevin showed clear signs of autism. But the family's response was deeply influenced by Chinese concepts of family honor and academic perfection. In China, Li explained, "We know about autism, but it is seen as shameful for the family. My parents say it's because we didn't care for him properly as a baby. My mother insists it's because I ate the wrong foods when I was pregnant." Wei, a trained scientist, understood intellectually that autism has neurobiological roots. But emotionally, he struggled with generations of cultural stigma. Dr. Mitchell, he told me, I read every research paper on autism. I know this isn't our fault. But how do I explain that to my family without making it seem like I'm rejecting our culture? Conversations like these pushed me to develop more nuanced approaches. I started working with community leaders, hosting educational sessions at the Southeast Portland Mosque, at the Catholic Church, where many Latino families gathered, and at the Chinese Community Center in Northwest Portland. Autism is not a disease that needs to be cured, I would explain in these talks. It's a different way of processing the world. Autistic children can live happy, productive lives when they get the right support. But they need their families and communities to understand and embrace their differences. One of the most moving moments came when Fatima Al-Hassan brought other Somali mothers to a group session. Ahmed had made real progress with speech therapy and behavioral support. But what mattered most to Fatima was seeing other families in her community embracing their autistic children. Now Ahmed goes to the mosque, and people see him as special, not broken, she told me 6 months later. My neighbor also brought her daughter for an evaluation. We are changing how our community thinks about these kids. But not every story had a happy ending. The Gutierrez family came to me after their 8-year-old son, Miguel, had been suspended from school 3 times for disruptive behavior. The father, Roberto, worked 2 jobs and often missed appointments. The mother, Carmen, was overwhelmed caring for Miguel and their 2 younger children. Dr. Carmen told me, exhausted, my family in Mexico says Miguel is like this because I'm not strict enough, that I should discipline him more. But when we try, it only makes him worse. Eventually, Roberto stopped coming to sessions altogether. This is an American thing, he told Carmen. In Mexico, kids obey their parents. End of story. Cases like this taught me that cultural competence doesn't just mean understanding different perspectives. It also means recognizing when those perspectives might block a child from getting the help they need. Sometimes, my role was to help families find ways to honor their cultural values, while still embracing evidence-based interventions. I developed partnerships with community organizations like the Latino Network and the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization. Together, we created educational materials on autism in Spanish, Somali, Arabic, and Mandarin. But more importantly, we created safe spaces where immigrant families could share their experiences without judgment. What we need to understand, Dr. Hernandez told me during one of our supervision sessions, is that when we ask a family to accept an autism diagnosis, we're not just asking them to change how they see their child. We're asking them to potentially separate themselves from their communities, their extended families, sometimes everything they know about raising children. It was a responsibility I carried heavily, and one that deeply shaped my approach in the years that followed. Not every story I'm about to share has a happy ending. In 15 years of practice, I've learned that sometimes even our best efforts aren't enough and that systemic failures can have devastating consequences for vulnerable families. The case that haunts me most is Jason Miller's. He came to me at age 9 after a traumatic history of misdiagnoses and inadequate treatment. His parents, both recovering from drug addiction, had lost custody when Jason was 5. He spent the following years in a series of foster homes, where his autistic behaviors were misinterpreted as conduct disorder or PTSD. This kid has spent the last 4 years being punished for being autistic, said Rachel Martinez, his caseworker at the Department of Human Services. None of the foster homes had autism training. They saw his repetitive behaviors as defiance. His sensory struggles were seen as aggression. By the time I met Jason, he was a deeply traumatized child who had learned to mask his autistic traits to avoid punishment. He knew that rocking or making repetitive vocalizations would get him in trouble. So he bottled up his anxiety and sensory overload until he exploded in meltdowns that seemed to come out of nowhere. Dr. Mitchell, he told me in our 5th session, "I know I'm different. But every time I try to be myself, people get mad at me. It's easier to just pretend I'm normal." At 9 years old, Jason had already developed what we call masking, a survival strategy, where autistic individuals suppress their natural behaviors to conform to social expectations. For adults, masking can lead to exhaustion and depression. For children in foster care, it can literally be a matter of survival. I worked tirelessly to find a foster home that understood autism, but options were scarce. Most foster parents in Oregon receive minimal training on developmental disabilities, and almost none on autism specifically. Eventually, Jason was placed with the Fosters, a family who had raised several children with special needs. But at 12, when he should have been thriving, Jason attempted suicide. He survived, but spent 3 months in a children's psychiatric unit. "I just wanted the pain to stop," he told me, when I was finally able to visit him. Not the pain of being autistic, the pain of having to pretend I wasn't. Jason's story forced me to confront not only the limits of my own work, but also the deep failures of the system that was supposed to protect vulnerable kids. As a society, we failed Jason not just by missing his diagnosis early on, but by creating an environment where being autistic was treated as something that needed to be corrected or erased. Another case that left a deep mark was the Thompson family, different from the Thompsons I mentioned earlier. Sarah and Michael were successful professionals with the financial means to seek out the very best treatments for their daughter Emma, who was diagnosed at age 3. The problem wasn't lack of access, but rather an overwhelming menu of unproven options. Portland, like many progressive cities, attracts peddlers of miracle cures for autism. Emma was subjected to restrictive diets, heavy metal chelation, high-dose supplements, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and a string of other unverified treatments. "We just want her to be normal," Sarah said through tears, after Emma suffered an adverse reaction to chelation. "We read about families who cured their kids' autism. Why isn't it working for Emma?" By 6, Emma had regressed significantly. The constant medical interventions, combined with restrictive diets that worsened her sensory issues with food, caused severe weight loss and an increase in repetitive behaviors. "Dr. Mitchell," Michael said to me, "we've spent almost $100,000 on alternative treatments. Emma is worse now than when we started. How is that even possible?" It was one of the hardest conversations of my career. How do you explain to desperate parents that love isn't enough? that money doesn't guarantee good outcomes if it's poured into the wrong places, that the pursuit of a cure can cause more harm than autism itself. Emma eventually recovered, but it took 2 years of intensive therapy to undo some of the damage caused by those unproven interventions. Her story taught me that having resources can be both a blessing and a curse, opens doors to high-quality treatment, but also to charlatans who prey on parental desperation. These cases taught me that my role wasn't just to diagnose and treat it, was also to educate families on how to navigate a world overflowing with conflicting information about autism. I began dedicating a significant portion of every intake session to discussing the difference between evidence-based treatment and unproven alternative therapies. My job, I would tell parents, is not just to help your child, but to equip you with the tools to separate solid information from empty promises. You're going to be your child's strongest advocate for the rest of their life. You need to be armed with knowledge you can trust. After a decade working in the field, I began questioning many of the approaches I had learned in graduate school. Daily experience with families was teaching me things no textbook had ever mentioned, and I felt the need to evolve my practice to reflect those discoveries. One of the biggest shifts came through my experience with Marcus, a 15-year-old teenager referred for problematic behaviors at school. Marcus had been diagnosed with autism at age 7, but had never received adequate therapy. His divorced parents, constantly in conflict, used his diagnosis as just another weapon in their legal battles. Dr. Mitchell, Marcus, told me in our first session, "Everyone talks about me as if I'm not in the room. My parents argue about how much therapy I need. My teachers make special education plans without asking me what I want to learn. Do you realize I have opinions about my own life?" It was a revelatory moment. I had spent years talking about autistic children, but rarely with them. My reports were written for parents and teachers. My recommendations focused on behaviors that bothered adults, not necessarily on things that would improve the children's own quality of life. Marcus was right, and his observation fundamentally changed how I conducted my evaluations. I began including the children themselves as active partners in the therapeutic process, not just objects of study. That meant adapting my language, using visual supports when needed, and most importantly, asking children directly about their experiences and preferences. "What's hardest for you at school?" I asked Marcus. "The cafeteria noise. It's like a drill in my brain. But when I ask to eat in the library, they say I'm being antisocial. They want me to learn to tolerate the noise, but why should I suffer when there's a simple solution?" Again, Marcus was right. Many traditional autism interventions focus on making autistic children behave more normally, instead of modifying environments to accommodate their needs. I began questioning whether our goal should be behavioral change or environmental accommodation. This led me to discover the neurodiversity movement, led by autistic adults who argued that autism is a neurological difference, not a disorder to be cured. Reading works by activists like Ari Neiman and Temple Grandin forced me to reconsider many of my approaches. Why do we assume that the typical way of processing sensory information is the correct one? I asked during a presentation I gave to colleagues at the Oregon Psychological Association. If an autistic person functions better in quieter environments, With dimmer lights and predictable routines, why don't we adapt the environment instead of trying to change the person? This perspective shift deeply impacted my work with families. Instead of focusing solely on reducing stereotyped behaviors, I began helping families understand the function of those behaviors. Rocking can be a self-regulation strategy. Repetitive vocalizations can be a way of processing stress. Intense interests can be sources of genuine joy. Emma loves trains. Her mother Janet said during a session, she knows everything about train schedules, types of locomotives, railway history. But the school says we need to limit this interest so she can focus on other things. What if, instead of limiting it, we used her love of trains as a bridge to other learning? I suggested math through train schedules, geography through railway routes, history through the evolution of transportation systems. This approach, working with children's interests and strengths instead of against them, began producing more positive results. Children seemed more engaged in therapy, families reported less stress at home, and teachers began seeing autistic behaviors as resources rather than problems. But perhaps the most significant change in my practice came through my experience with autistic adults. Portland has an active community of adults on the spectrum, and I began attending support groups not as a professional, but as someone eager to learn. Dr. Mitchell, said David, a 32-year-old autistic programmer, I appreciate that you want to learn from us, but you need to understand that many of us carry trauma from the therapies we received as children. We were forced to make eye contact until we cried. We were punished for stimming that helped us calm down. We were taught that everything about us that was different was wrong. These conversations were humbling and necessary. I realized that many of the techniques I had been taught, including some I was still using, were traumatic from the perspective of autistic people themselves. I began completely reframing my therapeutic goals. Instead of improving social skills, I worked on developing strategies to navigate social situations in ways that work for each individual. Instead of reducing repetitive behaviors, I focused on identifying useful self-regulatory behaviors and distinguishing them from behaviors that may be harmful. The goal, I told new parents, is not to make your child act like a neurotypical child. It's to help them develop tools to live happily and productively in a world that doesn't always understand how they process information. This paradigm shift was not easy. It meant questioning 15 years of training, admitting past mistakes, and sometimes confronting colleagues who still used approaches I had abandoned. But the results spoke for themselves. Families seemed happier, children seemed more confident, and I finally felt I was truly helping. Today, looking back on 15 years of working with families affected by autism in Portland, Oregon, I realize I have learned as much as I have taught. Every family that walked through my office taught me something new about resilience, about love, about the incredible diversity of human experience. Portland has changed significantly during those years. We now have more specialized clinics, shorter wait lists, and greater community awareness about autism. The Portland Public School District has implemented autism training programs for all teachers. The city passed ordinances requiring public spaces to consider sensory needs in their design. We even have an organization led by autistic adults that provides mentorship and advocacy for families. but we still have a long way to go. Low-income families continue to face significant barriers to accessing services. Immigrant communities still struggle with cultural stigma. Autistic teens and adults still find it difficult to secure employment and independent housing. And there are still professionals who see autism as something to be fixed, instead of understood and accommodated. What changed in me, more than anything else, was humility. I began my career thinking I had answers. Now I know the best questions often come from the families themselves, from autistic individuals themselves. My role is not to be the expert with all the solutions, but the facilitator who helps families discover what works for them. Marcus, that teenager who taught me the importance of including autistic voices in conversations about their own lives, is now at university studying software engineering. Emma, the girl who loved trains, developed an app to help autistic people navigate Portland's public transit system. Diego Rodriguez, whose parents fought so hard to access services, became a bilingual advocate for Latino families with children on the spectrum. These success stories didn't happen because we cured these children's autism. They happened because we learned to see autism not as a tragedy, but as a different way of being human, one that deserves respect, support, and opportunities to flourish. My message to families just starting this journey is simple. You know your child better than any professional. Trust your instincts. Ask questions. Demand explanations. And remember that the goal is not to have a normal child, but a happy, confident child who can navigate the world in their own way. For professionals who may be listening, my advice is even more direct. Listen to autistic people, not just families, but the individuals themselves. They are the true experts on their own experiences. Our formal education gives us important tools, but the lived wisdom of autistic people must always inform our work. And for the broader community here in Portland and anywhere you may be, remember that real inclusion goes beyond acceptance. It means creating spaces where autistic people can fully contribute, where their differences are seen as valuable diversity, not deficits to be overcome. Today, when I walk through the streets of Portland, past the downtown food trucks, the colorful Victorian houses in Alberta, the parks where families play on Sundays, I see a city slowly but steadily learning to embrace all forms of neurodiversity. We're not there yet, but we're on the right path. My journey as a psychologist specializing in autism continues to evolve. Each new day brings new challenges, new families, new opportunities to learn. But one thing remains constant: my conviction that every person on the autism spectrum has unique and valuable contributions to offer the world, and that our role as professionals and as a society is to create the conditions for those contributions to flourish. Autism is not something that happens to families, is part of the rich diversity of human experience. And the sooner we learn to celebrate that diversity, instead of trying to eliminate it, the closer we'll be to creating a truly inclusive world for all. This was my story, but it is only one voice in a much larger chorus. If this account touched you in any way, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share with others who might benefit from this perspective, and most importantly, add your own voice in the comments. Your experiences, your struggles, your victories, they matter. Together, We can keep changing the narrative about autism, one story at a time. Thank you for joining me on this journey.